She's been Director General of 3 different government departments in Queensland, and for that service she's been awarded an Order of Australia. So she is, I wish I had more time to talk about her. She's an amazing person. Margot Donnell is also a patron of New Farm. And so please warmly welcome Margot Donnell, MC, who will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you very much for coming along, and also to welcome our panellists who are here. I firstly want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the powerhouse is built and on the land around us, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I want to let you know that for those trendies amongst you using social media tonight, our hashtag is #PipNewFarm, PIP New Farm. We're streaming this event on Facebook Live, and it will be available to watch back on the community Facebook page. A podcast of the whole evening will be available in a week. You can search Politics in the Pub on iTunes. So how switched on are we? Okay, so this is how it's going to go. I've got a few questions that I thought I might ask the panel to start off, and they will answer and maybe even talk to each other about some of the topics for about half an hour. And then for the last hour, I'll throw it open to you guys to ask questions, okay? And can I tell you, I've got a whole heap of questions, so if you run out, I've got a few more up my sleeve as well, okay? I'll talk to you more about the format of the question asking, but, just to say we want to conduct these events in the spirit of respect and inquiry and understanding. So we want people to be, to be kind to the speakers, to not make declamations from the floor, but to encourage inquiry and discussion. Okay, thanks. Okay. So, let me introduce our panellists. From my far right, I'd like to introduce Fleur Kingham. Fleur was appointed President of the Land Court of Queensland in August 2016, having served for 10 years as a judge in the District Court. Before her judicial career, Fleur was a commercial litigator and an environmental lawyer. She advised governments on environmental and resources law. In 2011, she was the recipient of the Agnes McWhinney Award from the Queensland Law Society for her contribution to making justice more accessible to the community and bridging the gap between land and resources issues and Indigenous communities. In 2016, Fleur was, the Griffith University awarded Fleur an honorary doctorate. Would you welcome Fleur, please? Next to Fleur, many pieces of paper, is, in the middle there, is Kathy Schnitzling. Kathy is ABC's regional editor for Queensland, managing 10 bureau outside Brisbane and a staff of around 110, with a percentage of 57 female staff. She was the first woman director of news for the 10 network in Brisbane and Sydney and has worked as a television and radio reporter, presenter and producer on both state-based and national news and public affairs programs for 10, 9 and the ABC in 3 capital cities. She has also produced independent documentaries and a short drama. Would you welcome Kathy? So on my near right, Dr. Michael Flood. Michael is an Associate Professor in Sociology at Queensland University of Technology and an internationally recognised researcher on men, masculinities and violence prevention. He has made a significant contribution to scholarly and community understanding of men and boys' involvements in preventing violence against women and building gender equality. Michael has had a wide-ranging involvement in education and advocacy relating to men, gender and violence. Welcome, Michael. On my near left, Penny Spalding. Penny is the Assistant Secretary overseeing women and social welfare issues at the Queensland Teachers Union. In her role, she provides industrial support and advice on leave matters and flexible work options for state school teachers in Queensland and provides training and support to union reps. Penny is passionate about feminism, public education and social justice issues, including support for LGBTIQ students and teachers. Prior to her current role, Penny was a Queensland Teachers Union organiser at the Gold Coast and head of the Department of the Arts at Logan Lee State High School. Welcome, Penny. In the middle is Madeline Price. Madeline is the founder and national director of the One Woman Project, a youth-led not-for-profit advocating and educating for global gender equality. Madeline has just completed her arts law at the University of Queensland and has a wealth of experience of issues of global injustice, having previously directed the Alternative to Schoolies project, UQ Oaktree and Oaktree Queensland's Community Leaders Program. Madeline was also shortlisted as one of 4 finalists in the Queensland Young Australian of the Year Award 2015. She was shortlisted for the 2016 Young People's Human Rights Medal and spoke at a TED at UQ on the topic of workplace gender certification. Would you welcome Madeline? And finally, on my far left is Miss Blanks. Miss Blanks is the new face of Australian hip-hop. Her explosive debut single, Clap Clap, saw the industry clamber to celebrate this new powerful voice from Brisbane. Industry heavyweights have sung her praises, celebrating her confident sexuality and strong message of positivity and female empowerment as a force to be reckoned with. Alongside her music, she's a fashion and internet star and activist, having given talks in London for TED and in New York at NYU, all the while serving up an unapologetic rawness in all aspects of her career. Would you welcome Miss Blanks? Okay, let's get going. So, look, my first question is a sort of an easy one. I wondered if you would all the panel members would like to answer the question, are you a feminist? If so, why? And what does it mean to you? What does that term mean to you? And I think I'll start with you, Penny.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, I think. Well, clearly I am a feminist. As a women's officer of a trade union, I represent women who, comparatively to a lot of women in insecure work across Australia, have reasonably good and fair working conditions and excellent policy, being represented by quite a strong union. But in my day-to-day work, I see these women still struggling to have reasonable working conditions and a feminised workforce that is still battling to secure flexible work options, still struggling with discrimination around pregnancy and returning to work. And I'm also really passionate about the young women in schools and what I see as a lack of equity in the school system to support young women as well. And I think there's a really unique role that schools have in bringing, exposing through the teaching workforce and the need for a shift in the power balance and educational leadership to reflect what needs to be done and the work that needs to be done. And there's really a lot of work to be done there. Primarily, one of the key campaigns we've got running at the moment is it's still okay for state schools and non-government schools to discriminate with the uniforms that young women wear. There's still a lot of schools where students don't have the option to wear pants and shorts to school. So we've still got a long way to go when basic discrimination practices occur even in our state institutions like schools. So that really keeps me driving, and I see so much work that's still to be done, and that keeps me pretty fired up and passionate.
Thanks, Penny. I might just add, I'm old enough to remember when I was at University of Queensland in the 60s, there was a ban on women wearing trousers. Every woman on the university campus had to wear dresses. Pretty interesting. I don't know what would happen to you if you had turned up in trousers, but there you go.
Do they enforce that?
Yes. So, Fleur, what about you?
The question, am I a feminist? Yes, I most certainly am a feminist. What does it mean to me? I think it means different things in different aspects of my life. I think I was raised as a feminist. I was raised in a household headed by a single parent, by a mother whose own ambitions for a career as a performer. She was a very fine pianist. Her career ambitions were thwarted by the accident of conception. So I grew up just knowing that for women that there were things that could happen that might hold you back. But I grew up in an environment where I had perhaps an unhappy mother, but also a mother who was very determined to ensure that her daughters had options that she didn't have. So I suppose personally in my childhood, feminism was very much an individualistic thing. It was about me and my advancement and my mother's story, my family's story. As I got older, feminism started to mean more about other people. As I studied law and became more interested in the way in which law affected women differently to men, I think that drew me more into a much more outwardly focused interest in feminism. As a mother of 3 sons, of course, feminism is really important. It's been, I suppose, a goal of mine to raise boys who, as young men, start from the position that women are their equals, that that's the beginning of any conversation. And I hope we've got there. And as a judge, it obviously has an impact on the way in which I conduct myself in court and the way in which I approach my work. So feminism means lots of different things, but most importantly, or the underlying theme is awareness of the way in which a woman's experience might be different to a man's experience, being conscious of that, aware of that, and so that you can do something about it.
Thanks, Fleur. What about you, Michael?
Look, I'm not a feminist. I'm passionately pro-feminist. I think that men have a kind of an ethical obligation, a political responsibility to act in support of feminism, and I've certainly, worked as hard as I can as an academic and as an activist to encourage men to play a role in building gender equality and taking up feminist issues. But I don't think men should take the label feminist for ourselves. And I suppose I'm uncomfortable with men's use of the term because I think of exactly the issues you described about the difficulty of men sort of knowing women's experience and the kind of political issues there. So I'm nervous about what seems like potentially a colonising gesture. But really, actually, a lot of the time I'm delighted when men call themselves feminist or pro-feminist because, in a sense, what matters to me less is the labels they use and more that they are taking up a kind of an anti-sexist or an anti-patriarchal project. And so for me personally, feminism is a personal project of trying to address my own sexism, my own complicity in gender inequalities, and it's a collective project of trying to contribute to social change, contribute to broader social change, because that, after all, is what feminism is.
Good, thank you. What about you, Kathy?
I don't think I ever had a choice about whether I was going to be a feminist or not, because I was just born into a family of very strong women who made all the big decisions. There were men around, lots of men, they did all the heavy lifting. I mean, literally, they lifted heavy things. But all the smarts happened with the women. And my grandmothers and my aunties and my mother are all very strong women. And I also grew up in a very small outback town, which meant that there was no discrimination when it came to sport, not that I'm any good at sport, or anything else for that matter, because you needed every kid in town to be on the sporting team or you didn't have a team. So, and there was a lot of competition between the girls and the boys, and I can remember being very competitive that I had to be better than the boys. And I was very surprised once when I was trying to duck someone in the pool and they were stronger than me, and I thought, maybe I'll pull back from that now. But given that, I just have never felt like anything has ever stood in my way in terms of what I should and shouldn't do as a woman. If I wanted to drive trucks, then I would have driven trucks because that's what my dad did. And I joined an industry that is incredibly sexist, incredibly misogynist, incredibly unfair and discriminatory, yet here I am. And I think I am absolutely committed to trying to improve the role of women working in the media. I'm a member of Queensland's Women in Media organisation, which is all about, the way that we say it is, we put down the ladder to people who need a hand up. And so that's what we do. I've supported young females, and my background is mainly television. So it is full of eager young women who want to be on television, and it's a very, very seductive industry, but it will spit you out unless you prepare and you plan and you have a backup plan and you have plan B. And it always amazed me that I ever made it in television because I wasn't the prettiest girl in the room. But I had resilience and I had stamina, and I actually had some really good bloke bosses, and they were blokey bosses. But because I think I was a country girl and I stood up to them and I called them out when they said stupid things or touched you up, don't touch me, I'll kill you, that sort of stuff. It does work, and I think I have earned a degree of respect. In fact, there are very few, if any, I think before me, who were female heads of news or directors of news in the commercial sector. Certainly in the ABC there is. It's much more supportive of women. But in commercial television, it's pretty rough and tumble, and you have to be resilient to withstand it. And the tables are gradually turning. There are more and more young women who are now in positions of being producers and being editors and working their way up to positions where they make the decisions and they get into the upper echelons. So, yes, I'm a feminist, and I have a daughter who I think is a feminist, even though she's Susie Homemaker, and I have a son who, well, I don't think he knows any different either because he's been brought up in a family of women, so he'd better be good. Well, yes.
Thanks. Miss Blanks.
Hey. So as for me being a feminist, I still struggle with that term because I think also before I continue, I do also want to acknowledge non-binary folk. This isn't a conversation for just men and women, also for non-binary folk, and they need to be recognised through this conversation as well. A lot of what I may say may be a little uncomfortable for people to hear, but I think it's also important for you to sit in that discomfort. I think as allies to women, people of colour, trans community, I think it's important that unless you're having uncomfortable conversation, you're not having important conversation. So to follow that, thanks. Yeah, as for me being a feminist, I question that label or the movement a bit because for quite some time, historically, socially, globally, the movement hasn't supported trans folk, hasn't supported people of colour. It's not a movement that's been here for people like me. However, I definitely am, I'm a strong believer in gender equality. And I definitely think there's a lot of work that's been done. There's a lot of work to still be done. However, I'm still playing around with that term. And even though the movement may not be here for me or people like me, I'm definitely going to keep on fighting for that movement, even, if it's not for me entirely. So, that's the best kind of answer I can give on that.
Thank you. And Madeline, what about you?
I am a feminist. I actually had a bit of a strange evolution of feminism as I was growing up. So my mum and my grandmother on my mother's side, my grandmother on the other side, she's unique. She comes from a different generation. We're getting there. But they always actively believe themselves to be feminists. They really entrenched it within my sister and I. But I grew up in a rural area as the eldest daughter. So through unconscious bias, through subconscious situational placement, I just sort of became the token son of the family because it was only daughters and I was the eldest. So I got to learn all the farm things, and my sister got to learn how to use a rice cooker. So when I moved to Brisbane for university, I almost died. So for me, I always believed that I was a feminist, but I didn't really understand what that was. I would see things in my community where we'd have a barbecue and the men would be cooking the sausages and the women would be sitting in the showgrounds like buttering bread because that was the distinction that was made because somehow we can't cook sausages. And I just never really pieced together that was inequality. Like, I understood that feminism existed, but as a young person, I just never pieced together that was what was happening in my own community. That was what the whole movement was for. And so it was through that evolution, like as I got into high school, like I didn't shave my legs because I'm fundamentally a lazy person. And that was the first time I was ever called a feminist, but in a derogatory sense. And I think that's when it kind of twinged that not everyone was a feminist, and there is more to feminism than just believing that everyone's equal. There has to be some sort of participation in that movement to get to that point. So my journey with feminism has really shifted over the past few years, like coming to Brisbane, becoming more involved in intersectional feminist movements. Like, I grew up in a community that pretty much looked like me, and we didn't talk about anything that was underneath the surface. So coming to a little bit of a bigger place where we could explore things like the roles of women with a disability and how that impacts upon them, or other areas of intersectionality, class, racism, all of those different things, has been a completely different learning curve for me. And I think I'm proud to say that I think that's where the feminist movement is going, is to be a little bit more, or a lot more intersectional than it previously has been. Obviously, we're not there yet. Like, even if we look at the community in Brisbane, it can be horrendous at times. But we're slowly getting to a point where there's going to be involvement from every aspect of the community and every member of the community.
Thanks, Madeline. And that's a really interesting cross-section of views, I think, about this topic. I guess following on a bit from what you had to say, and also you, Miss Blanks, why do you think it is that, and I'd be interested in, particularly in your two views, and maybe Penny as well, that young women reject the term? I'll tell you a quick story. This is going back again a little way. When I worked at the Women's Information Service, I got rung by, I think, the English teacher at Girls Grammar, who was a man, asking if I or somebody could come up and talk to the grade 12 girls about feminism. This is quite a few years ago. And yeah, we were negotiating when and how and all of that. And he said, I hope you don't be offended by this, but would you mind sending someone in a dress and with lipstick on and who looks like a woman, he said. And I said, why would that be? And he said, look, they don't like these girls. These are girls from Girls Grammar. They don't like feminists, and they regard feminists as losers. They look bad. I am talking, I guess, about a while back when, overalls were big and things like that.
Good times.
But yeah, I thought it was interesting, and I actually went and did the talk. I did put lipstick on, I'm ashamed to say. But I just wondered what was going on there, and I wondered if, and I'm not sure, but I hear that there's still quite a feeling of don't talk to me about feminism. I don't want to be a feminist. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for quite some time, I think young women, young girls, and non-binary folk are, through social conditioning, expected to present, engage, respond, and react. Well, yeah, in a very narrow way. I think we kind of teach certain behaviours, especially in Australia, that you must, I guess, abide by and engage in. We create certain spaces, and we create certain language for specifically women to use. I feel like for quite some time, women and young women have been given the doing word to please. I feel like that's kind of the common tone. I think I can only speak on my behalf. I would like to hope that with time, things will change. But I also think a lot of young girls are reluctant to participate in, I guess, the feminist movement. again, for me, I've been quite reluctant to engage in it simply because there hasn't been space for me. I hate to use this as an example, but even in the lead up to this panel, there wasn't space for me on the panel. However, I was re-included through a lot of conversation. But I think that's an important thing for all of us to learn. Sometimes there's spaces that aren't set up for you, and I've learned that the hard way. That's not a safe space. And when we talk about power structures, even, I feel a lot of the times when it comes to the feminist movement and feminist spaces like these, I'm being invited into that space. I'm not part of that dialogue, which is a big concern when, for me, being a young, highly visible young trans woman of colour, I'm affected by that kind of oppression that feminism resists every single day, even the basic fundamentals of feminism, which is quite ironic. So I think for me, that's kind of my resistance to, my reluctance to wanting to get involved. However, I would hope that there is change coming for all of us to be part of the conversation and for all of us to contribute and accept that not one woman is the same, not one femme identity is the same. And I think the sooner we learn that, the sooner real change will come. And yeah, it's as simple as that.
Thanks, that's very thoughtful. I guess there's two responses really, isn't there? There's young girls saying, I don't want to be part of the movement. I don't want to go and march in the streets or whatever. And also them saying, I'm not into this. I'm not into equality for women, I just like the... Or what about the boys? In fact, I went and talked to a lot of girls' classes in girls' schools who would say to me things like, but miss, we feel really bad for guys, what's in it, what's happening for them?
That's because young girls have been, again, told for so long that they need to please boys.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Yep. So, Penny, you're bursting to say something, and then Madeline.
I think, especially going through teen years, there's so many struggles for young people, and I think at the core of it is finding your sense of belonging and your identity. And feminism has been given such a negative label over the years. When I was growing up, I think I had the fundamental, principles about human rights and justice and equality. But I'd grown up in a household where perhaps the term feminism wasn't used in a complimentary term. They were part of the others, and a lot of social movements, whether it was lefties, commos, or, there was these negative labels that were used so widely. And I think combined with that pressure, and I think it's similar to the point you're making, Sian, of young women, the pressure to be a good girl. And let's face it, part of the fun part of being part of the feminist club is not being a good girl. And saying no, you're meant to be compliant, you're meant to be respectful to your teachers, you're meant to be respectful to people in power, which is often men in suits or men in authority. And so I think a lot of young women might reject the term feminism, but it's a broad church and lots of people get there in a lot of different ways. And I'm really heartened where I see young people in schools setting up things like LGBTI safe places and ally clubs in schools, and in Victoria where there are state school students setting up feminist collectives in schools. So I think there's space there, and I think it's for those of us with power and privilege and acknowledging our power to do work for them to create the space, and that feminism needn't have that negative connotation.
Did you want to add anything, Madeline?
Yeah, I think a lot of it does come back to that pushback from birth. We're taught to sit up straight and close your legs and don't talk too much, but make sure you input a little bit so you're still seen as smart. And from birth, women are seen as guilty or feeling guilty, and they're not meant to participate and they're not meant to engage in their communities. But over the past 3 years, we've been running in-school workshops with young people, and it's been really interesting what we've found. Obviously not purely academic study, because it's very difficult to get students to remain in a classroom after the bell is gone to actually study their brains a little bit more about what they've just learned. But all girls' schools tend to be a hotbed for people not wanting to engage with feminism too much. Co-ed schools, even worse. Somehow, like, talking about lived experiences with your peers is just like, it just falls apart. All boys' schools have been great. I don't know why. It is absolutely absurd. Sydney Boys High School, we went and did some workshops there before their whole video about feminism exploded the internet, and they have literally been the best school we've ever engaged with in terms of being so clued in about global gender equality. But I think a lot of it does come down to the fact that for a lot of people and a lot of young people, feminism and gender equality aren't seen in the same sentence. So we'll go to a classroom and go, okay, we're going to talk about gender equality today, and the front row will go, oh, thank God you're not a feminist. So I think a lot of it does come down to the language that's being used around the issue of gender equality.
Sorry to cut you off there. I do also just want to say that also culturally, I feel like I know for me it's very difficult because in my culture, binary systems are very much in place. Whilst we have Fa'afafenga women, I guess the Western colonial term would be transgender women, the way, I guess, culturally we engage with each other, men and women, we play our parts, we play our roles, which is also a very difficult one. However, it's a tactic learned out of survival as well for a lot of cultures, and I think that's also another component that a lot of people, seem to dismiss when it comes to the conversation of gender equality, because there's so many other components with that as well. So, yeah, I also just want to make sure that we're including everyone in this conversation.
Sure. Unless is there any of you who want to add something here?
I do think that people actually, to follow on what you're saying, Penny, that there's a very negative connotation with being a feminist, and it goes back to the days of wearing overalls and having hairy armpits and demanding equal rights. And that all just became a whole lot of white noise. And if you say you're a feminist, you're branded as being one of those noisy, uncomfortable people who want to change the status quo. And we don't really want to argue with you, and we don't want to know about you at all. And quite the reverse. I know that when I was at university and I spoke at various different events at university, and I remember wearing lipstick and brushing my hair. And I went to the toilet afterwards and I heard people outside talking about me. It's like, if she's a feminist, why was she dressed like that? Because I had a skirt on and not pants, probably because it was clean. That was always clean. But I thought, oh, that's really weird. So I'm not genuine because of what I'm wearing. So it was just a label. I just went, well, I don't care really, because, I made my point, and whether you're worrying about what I'm wearing is not really up to me. So I think, feminism means gender equality. It's about striving for equality between the sexes. To me, that's what it's always meant, that you get a fair go the same as what a bloke does. So I think there just needs to be a whole shift on that. Yeah, gender equality. Thank God you're not a feminist. Well, what do you think it means? Get out your phone and have a look. If that's what it means. Yeah.
I think the feminist movement, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, and I might make myself a bit unpopular by saying this, but I think the feminist movement is part of the process that has led to the rejection of the label of feminism. So much of the debate that was going on campus when I was describing myself as a young feminist was about whether you could call yourself a feminist or not. There was a lot of exclusion that happened within that debate. And I suppose at the University of Queensland, when I was a student leader, the lesbian separatist model was the prevailing model on campus. And if you didn't fit that model, you were a right-wing woman. You couldn't call yourself a feminist.
Or you were bourgeois.
Or whatever it was. But I think that endeavour amongst the debate that happened in feminism in those emerging years, with groups trying to claim exclusively the title feminism, also led to some of the resistance and the rejection of the label.
And young women today who reject I don't want to be a feminist, I don't want to know about that. I think they really, hopefully when they do have some maturity outside of, grade 9, that they look and go, well, actually, if it wasn't for even, the lesbian separatists being very noisy at university and people like me wearing skirts when apparently I shouldn't have, we've done an awful lot to improve the lot of those young women, and things that they take for granted, don't even think about twice that they should have the right to, is all because of all of that noise and activity that did happen.
And I'd just like to add a little bit more about that debate and the impact of the lesbian separatist movement on me, and acknowledge that it was also there was a lot of positive outcomes for me from that struggle, because it also made me question what my relationship was with men, what sort of relationship I wanted to have with my partner, how I wanted to be. So it was a dynamic and challenging and at times very hostile and quite vicious debate. But I think that is partly the explanation for those who haven't engaged in it looking at feminism, saying, well, I think feminism means this stereotype and I don't want to sign up for that. Instead of, it would be good if we could get to the point where the feminist label is actually a very, very, very broad, high-level label. And then the next question is, well, what does it mean to you, or what sort of feminist are you? And make it a much more inclusive term.
Good point.
I
Do you want to add anything, Michael?
Just quickly, look, I think there's still a really pervasive kind of vilifying and stereotyping of feminism, but in fact I think there's been a significant shift in the last decade or so, and I think of someone like Beyonce, for example. Beyonce on stage in front of a massive sign that says feminist, and that's just one instance of a range of ways in which feminism has increased in popularity in the last decade. But as various feminist commentators have pointed out, the feminism that is popular in popular culture, is increasingly one that is defanged, that is co-opted, that lacks a political edge. It's a feminism defined by kind of personal empowerment, by sexual liberation, rather than by any substantial challenge to systematic gender inequalities. So I disagree that feminism is as unpopular as it ever was. I think there's been a resurgence in its popularity, but the kind of feminism that's being celebrated is the feminism that sells you stuff, and that's very troubling.
There was a piece...
Good point.
Just
Yes.
on that, I'm sorry, I know you want to move on, but there was actually a piece today that I read just before I got here, and the chain store Honey Burdette has been... the Advertising Standards Council has said, no, you can't use these pictures of women, beautiful models in gorgeous lingerie. You can't use them because you can see the model's nipples. And there is a group that they claim, it's just one group that has been targeting them. And, this is not about exploiting women. It is about empowering women so that they can wear this lingerie. So it was almost like an appropriation of that argument. Personally, I don't agree with that. I don't want to go and see, posters that are 12 foot tall of women wearing hardly any clothes in suggestive poses and say, gee, I feel really empowered now because I can wear them. No, because I'm going to look like rubbish wearing something like that. And also, it's really quite sexual. It's very sexualised, but it is about selling you something.
I do just want to, I know you want to move on, I just really need to say this. Going back on what you said, Kathy and Michael, I do just want to point out that I do agree that a lot of work has been done back in the early 60s and 70s for a lot of women. However, I think we need to remember that that work was to benefit white women. And bringing up Beyonce is an unfair argument. Using her as a talisman through that, when her work has been by black people for black people, especially her Lemonade album, even her recent Super Bowl performance. Her feminism is to empower cutie POC folk, queer, trans, intersex people of colour, just in case you didn't know. I think it's important that we recognise that those voices, identities and bodies need to be elevated and prioritised and supported and protected because they're not right now. I care about equal pay just as much as the next person against gender when it comes to gender equality. But right now I'm more concerned about trans folk dying. I'm more concerned about continued genocide in this country, especially to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in this country. So we need to be prioritising those identities as well through these conversations of feminism, because it's definitely one-sided at the moment, as much as you might think it's
I
not.
don't think you meant it as a criticism, though.
No, I don't think he meant it as criticism at all. But I think to use Beyonce as the catalyst for change is quite insulting. But,
To who? Beyonce?
No, to black women.
I see.
Yeah.
I was just going to make the comment, I'm nearly finished reading Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay, which some of you may have read, which is a very interesting title for a book about feminism. And basically, she's a good feminist. She says she's a bad feminist because she likes Pink and she watches popular culture shows and she likes female heroines. She's read the 3 50 Shades of Grey books, which she critiques very sharply and cleverly. But, you know, she's into all of that sort of stuff, unashamedly. But I thought it was interesting. I wondered whether that was a hook. She, by the way, is a Haitian-American woman, academic, and has experienced race discrimination, etc., etc. So, yeah, I wondered whether the title was to maybe try and entice particularly younger women to come in and read stuff. And interestingly also, I agree with Michael, a lot of her critique of the world now in relation to women and feminist issues is about popular culture, about the portrayal of women in the media and about violence against women, but not really about pay gaps and some of the other issues that are of great concern to women in terms of their, you know, financial situation. So, yeah, it's a complex area. I might also say, with some degree of authority, I worked at the first women's shelter here in Queensland a long time ago, and we had a lot of Aboriginal women who came through there, and the feminist movement then and now has always spoken up for Aboriginal women who've experienced violence, so they weren't left behind. They may not have been in the big discourse,
on a global level.
But on a service level they were there and were looked after. At refuges all around Queensland, yeah. Not in the way that any other woman who'd experienced domestic violence was, which was patchy. I totally acknowledge that. Okay, I think, are you ready to ask some questions? Okay, let's go over to you. I've still got my list, but let's see how we go. So can we get a microphone here? No, they won't hear you down the back. Where's the microphone? Was that too quick?
Yes, me. Watamali, hello. My name is Mara Johnson. I'm from Central Queensland. I'm a First Nations woman. We're the Birugaba, part of the Wagana Jagalingou people fighting the Adani Carmichael coal mine. What's up? I just wanted to, and thank you all for coming in, I also want to acknowledge that we're standing on unceded Yagara and Turrbal land, and so while no treaty exists, their sovereignty is never ceded. My question is about, so we talked a lot about feminism, people wanting to join the feminist movement or not, and feminism being a dirty word, or being called a feminist something derogatory, but we didn't talk about why, like who made it a dirty word, and also like why, and a little bit more on like the economic system and capitalism and the way that it oppresses women, and that's probably why men like to outcast women who identify as feminists as well. And also, just on a side note, not shaving your legs doesn't mean that you're lazy.
That's a very interesting question, because it links in with a comment by, let me just quickly have a look, Jessa Crispin. Any of you know of Jessa Crispin? Why I'm Not a Feminist? She says that one of her criticisms of feminism is that it's taken on too many of the patriarchal values of selfishness, competition, money, power, and is using these measures to judge success for women. So I wondered, and I think it links in a bit with what you were suggesting about why there's this thing about feminism isn't for me, you know?
Sorry. It's like there are women all around the world, Indigenous women on the front line of extraction, resource extraction, and black women and trans women as well. But we're talking about how many people are on boards, how many women are on boards, and it buys into that whole narrative that to be successful is to be like the man.
Yeah, yep. Thanks. Fleur, do you want to comment on this issue, this topic?
Well, I don't know if I have any answer to the question. I suppose it's an easy measure that relates back to what the birth of the feminist movement in Australia, which was very much about advancement of women, and it quickly became institutionalised as that. So we had an office for the status of women, and then they started to identify, well, what will be the key performance indicators to show that women are advancing, and it didn't. Once it went down that track, it wasn't looking for an alternative measure. So I suppose that would be my answer to the question, how did it get that way? Whether it should be that way is a different matter altogether. But I think that watching it over, over the last few decades, I think that is what happened, that the feminists who sought power in the 60s and 70s sought powers in political structures, and then they became part of the existing political and societal structures, not an external challenge to them.
Michael's been shaking his head here, so...
I think because, the dominant system is a patriarchy, and to fall into the things that women are good at aren't valued, and it's because our voices aren't heard. So in order to have your voice heard, you actually have to compete in that world to have your voice heard. So yes, we can be talking about having women on boards and having women in positions of power where their voices are heard, and it's through them that they should be helping to change the whole discourse. Doesn't always work out like that, because not everybody has a pure heart, but I think it's about having a voice so that you have to compete. You don't set the rules to the game, and it's very hard to establish a separate game outside that and have your voice heard. So I think that's probably why, that women have adopted the same language as the patriarchal system that we exist in.
Michael?
I was going to say, I worry about the histories we're telling at this event about feminism, because the types of feminism that are most visible, I think, in popular culture are the kind of lean-in feminism, which is about getting white middle-class heterosexual women alongside white heterosexual middle-class men in boardrooms and elsewhere. But from the beginnings of second-wave feminism, from the 70s and 80s and so on, there were radical feminists challenging men's control of women's bodies. There were socialist feminists challenging the intersections of capitalism and patriarchy. There were intersectional feminists such as Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks and a whole stack of others pointing to the intersections between racism and sexism and capitalism and so on. And it seems to me, I suppose we need to do our homework and make sure that we don't tell a kind of fake story, I suppose, about the types of feminism that have existed and continue to exist.
Good point, thank you. Is the question over here? Where's the microphone?
She's up the back, she's waving it.
Okay. Oh, there's someone up the back with the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, you, and then over to my right, far right.
Hi, I appreciate all the comments about the disparagement of feminism and some of the reasons, but I wonder if we could go maybe beyond blaming the women and blame some other parts of the system. We see Michaelia Cash and Julie Bishop very ready to say they're not feminists, and I wonder if they're in the same way that neoliberal forces have wanted to disparage the power of the collective union movement, whether they wanted to disparage the power of collective feminism. And we see this very individual and moderate feminism now. So I just wonder if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Good point. Penny, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I see the intersectionality of various social movements that are looking for progress, and I think, the women who have achieved power, really resisting that label. I think the question is spot on, and I think that the trade union movement has. In fighting for equality for working conditions, if we go back to the capitalist system and the power inequality, the currency is money. So if we look at the pay gap and the increasing casualisation of the workforce and the insecure work that predominantly impacts on women, we've seen the erosion of our penalty rate system, which again disproportionately impacts on women and young women and people in insecure work, that there is a real need for inclusion with feminism and unionism and working together. It's about the collectivism, and that I know I've had my own personal growth in understanding non-binary and trans issues, and I've still got a long way to go, and ensuring that policies and the unions that I work with are being really inclusive and moving with that. And I think movements are learning, they are getting better, and there is progress being made, but we've still got a long way to go, and we've got to bring people with us. And I think all movements, feminism isn't a card-carrying club, though take my money, I join. We need to be inclusive, and there's no one set model of feminism and what a feminist should look like and be like. And I think the points made earlier about being rejected because you wore lipstick or you wore certain clothing that you weren't true and pure, I think we really need to be more reflective and more inclusive.
Madeline?
I would definitely echo that point, and I think we do still exist in a patriarchal structure that supports and celebrates men who classify themselves as feminists but disparages women who classify themselves as feminists, especially when we look at women on the right who might not agree with such progressive and liberal ideas as women on the left, for example. And I think this is where we do need to come towards a sort of collective embodiment of feminism, in that even if someone doesn't identify as feminist, we should still celebrate them for the achievements that they're putting forward for women and on behalf of women. So, for example, Kellyanne Conway she was the first ever woman to run a successful presidential campaign. I don't agree with what she did, but should she not be celebrated for doing so? So even though she would not necessarily classify herself, don't even get me started, but she was a woman in a position of power who, if she was on the side of another candidate, would have been celebrated for what she did. So I think that is also a reflection that we do have to consider, that we can't pick and choose what makes a successful woman based on her ideals, when the job she's doing, for example, like we're talking about women on boards, we might not agree with every single woman who's on a board of a coal mine, for example, but she's still a woman on a board. We might not agree with her values, we might not want her to be in that position, but she's still got there. So, I don't know where I was going with that point, but I think it is, we do pick and choose who we see as a woman to value in society, especially when we look at positions of power, and it's still a very white, heterosexual woman ideal up there anyway.
Sian, I know you're about to say something, but if I could just introduce you, I think, by saying it does raise, what you're saying, Madeline, too, does raise that issue about why do we want women to be running things? What does it all mean? Is it good? Is Kellyanne Conway who expedited the movement of Donald Trump into the White House? Should we? What do we think about her as a woman operative? Do we want women to get these jobs because it's fair and equitable for women to get as many jobs as possible? I think or do we want women to get these jobs because they bring a special set of feminine and gender-related attributes which contribute to the job? So I think that's very complex and murky. Over to you.
I mean, just an interesting question I'd like to raise with that is just, at what point do we continue to celebrate women and femme identities if they're also the types of women to shut out other women and femme identities? I think that's an important question to raise through feminism.
Yeah.
And thank you for your clap.
I think there's an old saying that says there's a very special place in hell for a woman who doesn't help another woman.
Yeah.
So,
Amen.
you're right. Yeah.
Michael, do you want to talk about that issue about having women achieve positions and then... No, you don't. Okay.
I'd like to make a point.
Yep.
Representing women workers who are often confronted by decision makers of women managers. And they often say to me, I can't believe that my principal, who's a woman, or the person who treated me like this, and that a woman would do that to another woman. And my line I often say to the members is, an arsehole is an arsehole.
Yes.
You know, just because someone has a certain gender identity doesn't make them a good person or have certain values or morals. And sometimes people are arseholes.
Yep. Well said. There was a person over there.
Sorry, question here. Sorry.
Oh, well, can you take the microphone next over to that lady that had her hand up a long time? Sure. Okay.
This one pertains to...
Sorry, where are you? I can't see you.
Right down the middle.
Right in the middle.
Hello.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hi.
This is kind of coming off the back of what Kathy was saying relating to the Honey Burdette incident and advertising. And do you think that nude feminist protesters help women's rights, or is it more counterproductive? And Michael, I think I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
I'd love to hear your opinion too, Michael.
Wow.
Well, we start with Kathy as the woman in the media, and Michael, you can collect your thoughts. Kathy, what?
Well, the reason that I actually looked at that Honey Burdette piece was because, as I said, I got my Twitter feed open, and the picture that was on there were these two curvaceous women with lacy bras and their nipples exposed, and it was on the news.com site. So they've put it on, this has to stop. So it's clickbait, and I've gone, gee, I need to know about this for tonight. So I've clicked on it, but I'm telling you that I don't reckon everybody else who clicked on it because they were coming here tonight. They've clicked on it because they want to look at a woman's tits, you know. And that the Courier Mail, because that's the paper I look at, my daily paper. You will find women, girls in the surf because it's a hot day, girls in the surf because it's a cold day. It's just like, man, can we just stop doing this? Can we just get over it? Naked female protesters, do they help? Do they not? I think they get attention. And the media, which is still predominantly run by men and enabled by a lot of women who work in the media, commercial media, mainstream, they'll still show those pictures. So to me, does it help? Does it not? It doesn't really register because I think it's going to get attention, but maybe not for the right reasons, and no one's going to read to the second paragraph.
I think it's not I don't think you can answer that question in a simple way. You don't have enough information to be able to answer that question. Is nude protesting a good thing or a bad thing? One of the most effective protests or photographs from a protest about sexual violence against women that I've ever seen is a young woman. I think it's a European protest. She was very attractive. She was, I think, she might have been wearing, she might have been wearing some shorts, but she was topless. But she had written over her body in lipstick, still not saying yes.
Yeah.
Now, I thought that was an incredibly powerful use of her naked body to send a message. So I don't think you can just say naked protest by nature is good or bad. It's what you do with it. It's how you use it. And because it has the power to shock and grab attention of the media, and you really need to claim the media attention if you're trying to sell your message, I think that there is a role for naked protest.
Michael?
Yeah, look, I agree with that. And I think there's a broader issue, a really difficult issue in feminism about sexualisation and kind of what that means and how we understand that. So I want to tread some kind of fine line where on the one hand, I want to affirm women's sexual agency and women's rights to decide what they do with their bodies and women's rights to display their bodies and kind of fundamental principles about consent and bodily autonomy and integrity and so on. And on the other hand, there are ways in which that works in ways which can simply buy into what I think are really deeply patriarchal industries of pornography and, dare I say, prostitution. And I think that there's a kind of fine line there where what feels like empowering sexualisation may actually not be very empowering at all in some broader systematic way. So I think there are difficult issues here to navigate.
I think the other thing to consider is that when we do look at the famed nude protests that happen within the auspice of the feminist movement, they are very restricted in the types of people who are welcome to participate in those spaces. So everyone can go and watch the documentary on Netflix. There's a very famed documentary about how there's requirements in order to become involved in a lot of the famed protests that occur, not as much in Australia, but definitely overseas. So you need to be white, you need to be thin, you need to have... You have to definitely be of European descent. You have to have the body type that will become a front page story. And unfortunately, that's the downside of the nude protests, is that we're not encompassing what it means to be a human or a woman or anything like that, when we're only continuing to show a very narrow stereotype of what a feminist should be and what a nude feminist should be.
Well said, Madeline.
One of the really interesting things, sorry, I don't want to interrupt your applause, that I think grew organically in Australia, which I think is really positive, was the slut walks. You know, where it was certainly organic and social media helped to organise.
Can you talk about it?
Well, the slut walks originated in Melbourne, and it was about the, the inference around sexual assault and gendered violence that, based on what women were wearing, and that they invited unwanted attention, the same old journey. And a group of women got together and went, bugger off, I'm going to own the term slut, if you're going to call me a slut, and I'm going to march the streets wearing whatever I like and claim it with pride. And it grew through social movement, and there were some really big marches. I'd love to see it regenerated. And it was a bunch of young women marching the streets, organically claiming their bodies, wearing whatever they wanted. And there were some really theatrical and interesting get-ups, and there were certainly women of many backgrounds and body shapes embracing the streets, going, this is my body, hear me roar. Sort of not dissimilar to the Reclaim the Night movement, where again we see women taking the streets, and often a lot of really liberating and diverse costumes to make a statement and celebrate their bodies in a positive way. And I think they're uniquely women's spaces, and they don't get the attention of the mainstream media. They're not published in the Courier Mail and what have you, but they happen, and the women who participate in them often feel really positive about their participation.
Okay, another question. Where's my friend over on the right? But
Sorry.
You've moved, have you?
Hi, so the poster for tonight down at the Neighbourhood Centre has been amended to say feminism in Australia is racist. And before, when the panel was discussing criticisms of feminism, it was sort of like angry man haters, that sort of a thing.
It was, sorry, can you just repeat
It was
that?
more about angry man haters and the negative views of feminism in that way, I suppose, with the exception of Miss Blank's sort of touching on the racism and stuff. I suppose I want to ask, how do we listen more to what may be more valid criticisms of feminism where it does fail in intersectionality without getting defensive?
Yeah, I think I said it very clearly at the beginning of the night. Well, actually, before I get to that, I think it's important to sit down and be quiet and to listen. If you're going to be a better ally, when we deconstruct the idea of allyship, right? Allyship to people of colour, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folk here in Australia, to the trans community, to the LGBTIQ plus community, when we're looking at those various groups and we want to make sure our feminism is more intersectional and inclusive, we need to sit down, be quiet, listen. I also think certain spaces, while I also think it's important for, I think men holds a huge role in feminism and gender equality in the fact that sometimes they need to be quiet and listen, and not take up all the space, and not to assert their views or assert any kind of idea of how they feel, especially when, you know, they're the oppressor. Sorry. And especially when we're looking at, you know, oppressed, marginalised groups that aren't part of the conversation. We need to ensure that we're making room for them, we're prioritising them, we're supporting, protecting and elevating them, rather than the same old groups of people that are always going to be on a historic level, socially and globally, celebrated. Those groups of people are constantly celebrated. So we need to make sure that if we want to keep it more intersectional and more inclusive, I'd like to also talk about safe spaces as well, but I also feel like we don't have the time. But I also think, no one can ever guarantee safety. So I really struggle with the idea of safe spaces. I think making sure things are more inclusive, and through that with feminism, it's really important. But for now, I think, if you're going to be an ally, or even if you're not an ally, if you're parts of those groups, because there's many women that are very anti-women as well that I've met. There's a lot of trans exclusionary radical feminists. And they need to be quiet and listen and, take some notes. So that's my answer.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that question? No? Yes,
I'm always fond, and I have to, constantly keep checking myself, is around listening. And Gloria Steinem always says, the more power you have, the less you should talk and the more you should listen. And I think that's really powerful.
Okay, who's got the microphone next? Okay, over here.
Thank you. I'm just sort of wondering if the panel could answer, in terms of returning to Marxist or socialist feminism, if we really highlight that link between female subordination and the capitalist mode of production. While I feel that first, second and third wave feminism have moved us further out of domestic life, what are some of the arguments? An argument I come up a lot against is meritocracy. When people talk about quotas, the argument there is for meritocracy. So could you guys give me some of the talking points that you use to rebuttal that one?
I might just, by way of introduction, thank you for the question. Anne Summers has just published the Women's Manifesto, which is a list of 4 demands for the next 5 years of the government, which relate to safety, gender, parity in wages and a range of things. One of the things she references is Australia has gone from number 15 to number 46 on the gender level of equality in the world. We're behind Rwanda, New Zealand, a range of things, and it's mostly related to pay and work conditions and financial security, etc. So it's looking pretty bleak at the moment, quite frankly. Michael?
Just on meritocracy, that's a great question. I'll leave the capitalist mode of production alone, although it's refreshing to hear the phrase. But on meritocracy, I think the most obvious thing to say, which I'm sure you do say, is that, in fact, we already have a systematically biased system. In fact, white men have been the recipient of a systematic program of affirmative action, and that's visible in the fact that there are more people named John in the top 200 boards in Australia than women of any name. And in fact, so one of the first things to say is we don't already have a meritocratic system. We have a systematically biased system, as countless hundreds of experiments sending in resumes from Henrietta versus from Henry show and so on. So point them to the evidence about systematic bias and that we need to address that. And second, I'd point out the fact that there's no level playing field in terms of how women and men are assessed, and the divisions of domestic labour, which structure women's and men's potential participation in work, and women's and men's differing networking opportunities and differing levels of inclusion and so on. In other words, point to the systematic patriarchal biases that boost men and give men, like people like me, white, heterosexual, middle-class men, able-bodied, every form of privilege there is, give us a systematic boost while holding people without those forms of privilege down. That's where I'd start, I suppose. Perhaps speaking slightly more slowly and using more accessible language. Yeah.
I think it would be good to use an example that shows beyond doubt the impact of unconscious bias. And one I like to use is about violinists, male and female violinists. And I can't remember which orchestra it was or even where it was, but they went to a system of blind auditions, and they
Royal
took...
Philharmonic,
Yeah.
Royal Philharmonic.
Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, and they took it very seriously. The people who were auditioning were told not to wear shoes so that they couldn't tell from the heels going across the floor that it was a woman rather than a man. And the orchestra, as I understand it, considered that they didn't have a problem, that they didn't have a bias towards male auditioners, but they had many, many, many more male violinists than female. And the result of the blind auditions was that they chose women far more often than they had before. And the people who were conducting the auditions were quite blown away by that, because as far as they were concerned, they were not biased. So it's unconscious bias, very hard thing to beat.
There was
Self-awareness.
that example in Tropfest this year as well, I believe, that they removed the identities of the filmmakers because they'd had such a low number of women filmmakers had their films included, and when they took that out, I think it rose exponentially to about 50%. And so, yeah, absolutely. Many years ago, a colleague described merit selection as mates elevated regardless of intelligence and talent, and that has always stuck with me.
Okay.
Just at the back again, sorry.
Yep.
I just wanted to put to the panel, Annabelle Crabb's book, The Wife Drought, raised a point about the women's revolution stalling because men haven't had their own revolutions. So women have expanded the definition of what it means to be a woman. Women are out of the home and going to work and actually graduating from university at a higher rate than men. However, men haven't expanded the definition of what it means to be a man in terms of getting out of the workforce and back into the home and taking part of some responsibility of those domestic chores. So women often leave the workforce to look after children and bear a huge brunt of that responsibility, and there's a real stalling there. So I just wondered what the panel thought about, like, the future of feminism and how to, I suppose, how to expand the definition of what it is to be a man to help that issue.
Thanks.
Look, there's two versions of that story, and in one version of that story, it's poor men. Poor men, they've been left behind, no one's focused on men. Men are now the victims, we need to pay more attention to men. And there's serious, empirical, and I know Anne's not saying that herself, but that's a version of this story that I think has been popular, unfortunately. But a much more accurate and I think politically useful version of this story is that you're exactly right, that there's been far less attention to the ways in which to shift dominant definitions of masculinity. And that makes perfect sense because we're talking about a system of power, a system of inequality where those in power, those with privilege, are resistant to change to that, just in the same ways that conversations about racism are much more about Indigenous people and ethnic minorities than they are about changing what it means to be white and changing white people's investments in racist privilege. So just in the same way, you're talking about ally politics, Sian, I think that's exactly right, that part of this work has to be making the case to men. And there are various ways to appeal to men and to challenge the kind of resistance and backlash that many men often offer to feminism. And one of the ways is to say that men will benefit. Men will benefit from progress towards feminism. Some men will have to leave corporate boardrooms, men will have to give up sexual entitlement, men will have to give up various kinds of unfair power, but men will benefit too in terms of their personal health and well-being, in terms of their intimate relationships and friendships, in terms of their involvements in family, in terms of the benefits to community and wider society and so on.
What century are you talking about?
I'm talking about now. I think that...
I don't reckon that's going to happen for a really long time.
Well...
You've got the privilege, why would you want to give it up?
Well, for two reasons. One, because you've got no choice, because the laws make it hard to practice privilege anymore and because people around you are pressuring you to give up privilege. That's one reason to give up privilege, and that's how slavery ends and other things ends, is that people don't have a choice but to give up privilege. And second, because people see it as in their interest. In the same way, why do we think white people are going to take up racism? Why do we think heterosexual people are going to deal with homophobia? They do so partly because they're pressured by social norms, by shifts in law, and partly because they see their own stake in that. So for men, the classic appeal to men is, in terms of their own daughters and sisters and so on. Now, of course, that's limiting because we want men to care about all women and all people, not just the women they know and the girls in their household. But I think part of our work in challenging the social injustices to do with gender has to be getting members of the privileged group to see their own stake in a feminist future. It's hard work, but I think that's a critical part of this work.
Okay. Yes. Another question? I can't see who's got the microphone.
I'm in the light.
You're in the light. Okay, down the back. Yep.
My question's a little bit different. It's around the imposter syndrome that many women in higher up positions feel. They feel like they're fraudulent or they're imposters in their own positions and they don't feel like they've earned their right in that job. First part of the question is, have any of you felt that way in your positions or past positions? And why do you think that women feel that way, and why do you think you felt that way?
I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to say I haven't felt that way, but I've been told that I've felt that I should feel that way, but I haven't felt that way. I don't think that's the way women who have worked hard to get where they are feel about themselves. Generally. Certainly that's not my experience.
Yeah, tonight. Absolutely. And one of my colleagues down there, because I had this conversation with her yesterday, I've been really surprised. I've been fortunate in my role that I get to invite lots of really dynamic feminist speakers to events we host. And I'm always astounded at women who I look at as being incredibly articulate and confident and frequently in the media prior to going on to do an event being really nervous and really absolutely articulating the imposter syndrome. And I think there's a couple of things. I think it's around... I've only had the privilege to get a couple of chapters of Jamila Rizla's book, Not Just Lucky, and I'm really keen to get into that, talking about how women in the workforce who achieve success sometimes think they've got there by luck rather than their own merit or hard work. But I think there's also a certain amount of respect that women have in wanting to bring other people with them. And I know a lot of good folk I've worked with bring women with you as well. And it's like, well, if you're inviting me, why aren't you inviting this person and this person as well? But it's very real. I know a lot of the women I work with and deal with have it. I absolutely questioned why I was invited along here today and spoke to some of my friends and colleagues about it. It's real.
I might add, I've had quite a number of senior positions in various governments and on boards and things. I've always suffered from the imposter syndrome. I've thought someone's going to find out that I'm not that good. It's interesting because also there's been some research, quite a few pieces of research, but one in particular which measures that when men achieve or do well, and they actually did it with boys in school, when boys do well in a subject, it's because the boys say, because I'm so good, I'm really good at maths, or I'm good at English or whatever. If they fail, they say it was the teacher's fault.
It's always the teacher's fault.
And the girls are the exact opposite. Girls say, I'm not very good at... If they fail in maths, they say, I'm not good at maths. I'm no good at maths. And if they do well, they say, I had a lot of help. My teacher helped me and that sort of thing. And I think a lot of us, and I'm certainly one of those people, I took that view forward. I used to think, when are they going to find out that I'm really not as good as maybe they think? And in fact, one of the things that helped me jump over that a bit was when I became a Director General of a department, I was talking to this guy who I knew who was an idiot, who was putting his name forward to be Director General of the Environment in Queensland. This is in the Beattie government days. And I said to him, he was a lawyer and he'd worked with me in the Justice Department. And I said, do you know anything about the environment? He said, we recycle. And that was his, that was his claim to the job. But he said it with such verve, such confidence that he would just go into it and, he'd be fine, he'd get people to help him. And so I thought, OK, if he can do it, if he can run the Environment Department, I can run anything.
I certainly had the imposter syndrome when I first became Director of News, and I think it was simply I kept waiting for people to find out, maybe I'm not so good at this. How did I get here? It's all smoke and mirrors. But it is actually about hard work, and I didn't have any role models. There was no one ahead of me to look up to and go, oh yeah, I can do this because somebody else did it. I was that first person that I ever knew who'd done it. And then you get over it pretty quickly because you realise you're working, you and your 10 mates, and most of them are idiots, and you can sit in a meeting and you can say, I think this would be a good idea if we take this strategy and we go this way. Then they all sit around, they talk about it, they say it again, and then some bloke from Adelaide will go, I reckon this is a really good idea. And I'll go, hang on a minute, am I just speaking some other language here? I just said that. Shut up, it's my idea. I've got to sit around and listen to you gasbag about it. You soon get to the point where you realise if the idiots can do it, so can you.
She keeps pointing at me, but it's...
No, it's pointing at
it's metaphorical, I'm hoping.
No, nothing to do with you.
OK, another question. Where's the microphone? OK, over here.
My question is probably more directed to the left side of the panel. It's about the gender revolution idea. I basically want to know what you think, because I was raised by a strong community of second wave feminists who very much identify with womanhood and bringing women forward. But in my experience, as the younger generation of feminists, we're sort of talking about moving away from gender labelling because it is restrictive. And whether we have 2 genders or 5 genders or whatever, ultimately gendering anyone does sort of limit them and put them into a box that is difficult to move out of, as we know, men and women in our experiences. So I want to know what you guys think, because a lot of my friend's mum and my mum, they think, like, come on, like,
it's just
men
about
and women,
equality.
we know who we
It's
are.
just about equality. It doesn't actually come down to what sex you are or what gender you are or what race you are. It's just about equality. That's what it means for me. It's about that everybody should have an equal go. I don't know what wave of feminism that is, but I'm that wave. And I was born in 1963. So, to me, it's just about everybody being given a fair go, having the right to have a fair go, being given the opportunity to be equal and to participate equally.
I'm going to quickly chime in. I'm going to quickly chime into that. I think we need to break down and deconstruct the idea of binary systems and how they're applied, what they mean, what they represent. When it comes to men and women and non-binary folk, I also think that, where was I going with this? Who knows at this point? But I also, I'll find it. I also think that there's a lot of men and women and non-binary folk who really need those labels, especially in the trans community. I need the label female for survival. For me, I'm more than happy to take that label and I'll hold on to that because that's all I got right now, right? So I think while it may not be for all, it is for some, and we need to include those people. Me, I am those people, and make sure that, however, through that label, what that means to be female, what that means to be male, non-binary, and so on, I think, and also culturally, we were talking colonial, like, we need to also look at colonial English language. Like, in my culture, we don't use male, female, and non-binary. We have gama, genge, and fa'afafenge women and men. And the way folks operate within binary systems aren't exactly mirror to how Western binary systems are in effect. However, it's important that, if those labels don't apply to all, they do to some, and what those labels mean are important. There's something to look at as well in terms of their representation. So and also culturally.
Can I just add, I think that there are two aspects to that question about gender neutrality or gender revolution. I mean, on the one hand, there's the issue of stereotyping, gender stereotyping, and I fully get that, the need to break beyond that, because that's what restricts men, women, transgender, feeling the need or the desire to choose one of those labels is about, well, this, I'm associating with this identity. So I get that, but there's also, I don't think we should lose sight of the gendered experience of things, and I would be sad if feminism lost sight of the way in which law can impact on women differently to the way it impacts on men. So I think that the gender labelling and the focus of feminism on women's experience has that aspect to it. Yes, break out of the stereotype of the gender, but let's not lose sight of the reality of the lived experience of women and how it is different. And I don't know that if we reach nirvana and we do get to a gender neutral space, then it may no longer be necessary, but I think it's still at this stage of our development. We do need to hang on to a gender focus from that perspective.
Thanks, Flo. Yes. Sorry, who's got the microphone? There's a few here.
Actually, mine was just a comment. Thanks very much for the stimulating little debate that we're having. But I also wanted to bring in the aspect of, the planet being so important in terms of preservation, and the ecofeminism movement as well, which was a very strong influence as well for standing up for the planet. But also, from a spiritual angle, also understanding the male and female attributes that we have within ourselves, and the play of the, if I can call it, the yin and the yang as well. So just
Thank you. Yeah. Does anyone want to comment on that, or will we just take that as a comment?
Does anyone else want to comment before
Go
I
for it.
hijack the panel? Yeah?
Briefly?
I think the best person to answer this would be Marwa, sitting in the front row here. Marwa, do you mind answering this question? Sorry to put you on the
spot.
spot.
Put her on the spot, and she hasn't got a microphone, so can we get a microphone to her? Briefly.
Sorry, just ecofeminism. I think, just a really important point. If we're going to talk about feminism, this is like my ish as well. Put my wine down. I really want to be on this panel. So when we... And I don't know if this links into what you're talking about. If we're going to talk about feminism and sort of like women having control over their bodies and all of these things, we're actually not talking about consent yet, and I think that's really important that we should be talking about...
Can you answer the lady's
Yes.
question, please?
So the world generally, for most cultures and sort of like epistemologies, gender the world as a woman, Mother Earth. And so when we talk about extraction as well, and the destruction of the environment, and especially the genocide of Indigenous peoples who say that they speak for that environment and give or withhold consent about what can happen to that particular place, we're talking about rape culture. So it's just that simple, that ecofeminism is kind of like a way to address rape culture on the largest scale, which is the fact that you think that, so you gender something in a certain way, which is most times to be a woman, and think that you can extract from it and forcefully penetrate it with like giant drills and whatnot. Trigger warnings, but that's kind of what we're dealing with, I think.
Thanks. Okay, thank you for your comment too. Okay, down the middle.
Thank you for that.
Hi, I want to know, I guess, looking at a little bit on that question as well. What do you believe will be in the future for feminism? What's the agenda in the next 10 years? And particularly because it seems that there are certain groups that are forever catching up. We always behind. And I think you raised some really important points, Banks, about sitting discomfort and reflecting upon them. So for the panel, what are we going to be discussing in the next 10 years that hopefully will include all women or all of those that identify as women?
Thank you. You've stolen one of my questions. Thank you. Kathy, do you want to go first with that one?
Oh,
if you don't.
The future of feminism.
Yep.
Well, I think it requires a lot of courage. It still requires as much courage as, when women were chaining themselves to fences in order to get the vote. It requires a lot of courage, a lot of resilience, and a lot of listening for the future of feminism. But I think at its heart, to go back to what Fleur was saying, I guess maybe because we're a little bit older and experienced what that was like in university life, in the 70s and 80s, we still have to remember what all that was about, and that it was not for naught. It doesn't mean we have to cling to it, it just means that we have to continue to evolve and to be more inclusive and more thoughtful and to listen and still to have courage and to keep fighting so that we can make the world a more equal place.
Madeline, what do you think?
I think...
You're probably the youngest person here on the panel, I think.
I'm like a baby. Oh, yay, I do it. I think a lot of what we're doing in the feminist movement at the moment is breaking down a wall, then turning around and pulling other people through it. And I think what we should be doing instead is breaking down the wall together. And I think that's where I want to see the future of feminism going, is walking alongside each other rather than turning around and going, oh crap, I left someone behind. So I think that's where I want to see the future of feminism going. In terms of like the massive issues we've got to face, that is just so far reaching, can't prioritise any of them because there is, well, I can prioritise some, there's a lot more to do with the safety of individuals, of looking towards a collective feminist movement. Obviously, we want to talk about things like pay gap and people on boards, but when, as you said before, people are dying, that's where our priority should be. So I do think having that wall there, we need to be breaking it down together, though.
Penny?
Yeah, I think we need to really focus on law, policy and government. I'm a firm believer in quotas, and I think we need to get more equality in our public representation. I think we need to, there are some fundamental laws that I think we're still, even in Queensland where abortion is still a crime, there's still some fundamental initial steps we're yet to gain. And I think women on boards is really important if we're going to have policy change that impact on the most needy. And I don't think it's either or. We've got to be doing that at the same time that we're making sure that, the gap is closing, and that we are still fighting for things like the gender pay gap is just absolutely appalling. And if we look at the amount of women who retire in poverty in Australia and the disproportionate amount of women who are reliant on the age pension in their retirement, there are some really fundamental basic living conditions we need to make really strong social change on, and we can only do that by women's participation in law and policy making. So those women in board positions, the political positions, they're really important, but I don't think it's that to the detriment of the other really important work that needs to be done. I think there's space and work for everyone to do in all those areas.
Thanks. Thank you.
And I think probably, just going back to a point that Madeline just made about, people are dying, I think that we probably need to concentrate on our laws and our education system more so that we don't have, at least one Australian woman that we know of being murdered every week by someone they know. I think that's really important. So that's something that we need to change because
And one of the most practical ways we can try and influence that change is the introduction of respectful relationships programs in our schools. So there was this great program developed, written up by the Education Department. The curriculum is all there, P to 12, but no school, well, very few schools either know about it or are accessing it. It was one of the recommendations out of the Now Not Ever report. Victoria's model is mandatory in all schools, and the Education Department has this great resource, but schools don't have that space or time or money to do real engagement and pick it up. It's brilliant work. It's a real, if we're talking about generational change, that is the fundamental work that we can do in schools. And I encourage anyone who's involved in schools to go back and ask that question, why aren't we doing that in our school? Because that's where we've got to start. And there is great work that's being done, we just need people doing it.
Thanks. Sian, do you want to comment on where's feminism going to be in 5-10 years? Or what's the world going to look like ideally in 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I have I guess where I'd like it to be in 5 to 10 years. I'm not going to even try to answer how it's going to get there. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of pain and hurts with a lot of groups of people, a lot of women and non-binary folk all around the world. And while it's great to, have these conversations, and keep in mind this conversation doesn't end here at the end of the night. I encourage people to go home and do their research and continue this conversation. I think also, before I answer the question, I just want to say I think it would be great if everyone could look up online. Unfortunately, you can only look on it at a desktop. I tried on my phone, didn't work. Really upset. That was supposed to be a joke. But yeah, Feni Sosa's a guide to welcoming people of colour and their audiences. Really encourage everyone to read that. There's a lot of, I guess, cross discussions that link to feminism that's, I really think is important. But where I see it's going, I think, like I said, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of hurt. We need to make sure that we're listening, and we have a strong willingness to learn and also unlearn. I think we need to unlearn certain behaviours as well, even if they are a tactic for survival, especially abusive behaviours that we may not see them being to other groups of people, especially within that femme movement. But we need to listen, we need to be compassionate, we need to be considerate. On the flip side, sometimes we need to be angry, and those feelings are valid, and be vocal and stand up. And also, I respect you if you are that person, and also if you're not. But if you are that person, I commend you for the emotional and mental labour that you're doing every single day to step out and be that vocal person. Especially, women of colour and Indigenous women. It's really important. So that's, I guess, I don't know if that answers the question. I just feel like,
sure.
A few things,
and I think
options.
Part of the focus of the question was also how do we bring women, particularly women of colour and disadvantaged women, with the steps where we're going. Do we bring them with us, or how does that work?
Well, I think when you say bring you with us, to me, I could be wrong. You fact check me. But to me, it's like there's structural power there. It's like we are these, we're on the front line, and we're pulling you through. We're, also like savior complex, hate that. We're helping you through. So like, I don't know if it's so much we're gonna bring you with us. I don't know, let's talk about language and what maybe the right words are to be used when it comes to that.
Good point. Another question? Yeah.
I'll try and make this brief. Tonight we've spoken very conceptually about feminism, and I think Penny's touched on what I want to ask about is some practical measures as to how we can sort of move forward as a society, given that, we still have a large underrepresentation of women in politics. And there's an increasing number of women who are experiencing homelessness and poverty in this country at retirement age. And I just really want to hear what people think are some really practical ways that we can get involved and, really make some steps and some changes and, move forward.
Who wants to go first? I'm happy to. Okay, Penny.
I'm going to say join a union. Absolutely. So I'm incredibly biased, but I'll, acknowledge that. I think there is. I think people need to stand up, and I think some of the good work around, because to me, equity, it's around power in the workplace, it's around power in schools, about power in relationships, and people, we've become so individualised. Around it happened around individual contracting, and this notion that you can go out and look after yourself. And we know there's a power imbalance there, and I think some of those fundamentals about access to quality education and having quality free public education, including tertiary education available to everyone. I think it's around campaigning for things that matter, and I think along with the resistance of some young people to claim labels like feminists, there's also been this, I don't really like politics, and reclaiming that space that politics isn't something to be shunned. We've all got a responsibility to have a voice, especially for those that don't, and use the power we have. And politics is a really practical way that you can do that. And I think working as collectivism, unionism, certainly along with feminism, got a really bad rap. But, I think there's a really strong resurgence at the moment. Sally McManus, as the first woman secretary of the ACTU, is doing phenomenal work. And really the penalty rates campaign and those sorts of moves to actually get some equity back. And things like the minimum wage case every year. I think there's real power in the collective, and people shouldn't be afraid of joining up. And if you don't like the way a certain union or political party is, because they're all imperfect, get in and be a voice and be that change.
Anyone else want to add to that? No?
I think if you believe in something, you just have to try and do something about it, basically. So if you're concerned about the number of homelessness or domestic violence victims, you just have to become a part of that and try and do what you can to change that. It is about collectivism. It is about, putting your money where your mouth is, basically, and getting behind it. They're the practical things that I think that you have within your own power to do something about.
Can I again refer you to this manifesto, which has 4 very practical suggestions for the next 5 years. This is Anne Summers' document and a group that she's involved with, obviously. And they are: 1, legislated equal pay for all women in all jobs by 2022. Decriminalisation of abortion in New South Wales and Queensland. It's still a crime in these 2 states. Thirdly, specialist domestic violence courts in every state in Australia. It's not going to fix domestic violence, but it's one thing to go for. And the 4th thing is quotas, gender quotas, dictating that women make up 50% of parliamentarians, cabinets, boards, ministries, directors of public companies, etc. It's happening in other countries, quite a number of other countries. Why can't we at least set that as a target? That's what she's saying. So there's some practical suggestions there. Okay, I think we've got time for about one more question. I see a hand up at the back.
Hi. Thank you, everyone. My comment's a little bit along the line of the last question there about moving forward. And I guess I just want to make a comment and ask you for some feedback. I actually teach at a university, and I have young men and young women in my classes. And when the F word comes up, I've developed some strategies to kind of introduce this notion to them, because both groups are quite resistant. And the first strategy is to remind them that patriarchy actually oppresses everyone, men and women, and makes some quite narrow spaces for people to fit in. And the women are on board with that, but some of the men go, yeah, I don't quite fit in either. So it gives them a bit of an idea there that there's some oppression happening. And the second thing I do is talk about privilege, which really does seem to hit the spot for people who are trying to understand the idea of oppressive ideas and how privilege can be unearned. So I'd be interested in what else I can do to be getting people on board with some of these ideas, because as you've said, the dominant groups find it very difficult to engage with the idea that they might have to give up some of that privilege. And the young women don't like the F word, except where it's about what they might miss out on.
I think I'll take that as a comment. I think that's pretty interesting because there's... Okay, thank you. There were a couple more questions. There's one here in the middle. There we go.
Thank you. I'm a little bit nervous because a lot of people here. It's a practical question. I'm a case manager for a youth service, and we work with a lot of young men and women from a lot of different backgrounds. We have a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young men and women, and all sorts of backgrounds. And what I'm asking tonight, very vulnerably, is some advice. We work with, for example, I work with a lot of young women, and when I heard the Beyonce comment tonight, I work with a lot of young women who are in very unhealthy relationships and are the victims or survivors of domestic violence. I do use Beyonce when we're in the car. I put on Flawless to remind her that she's gorgeous when her boyfriend won't hold her hand in front of prettier girls, or will look at girls in front of her on Facebook or something like that. So what I'm asking for tonight is if you've got any advice maybe on how we can empower our young men and women with our future generations.
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great
Thank
question. I'm going to quickly take that. So just a couple of things in there. I think when it came to the context of what we were discussing, I think it definitely held. As for, reminding beautiful black men and women and non-binary folk that they're valued, and using, say, Beyonce, as a way of reminding them, I would say that's okay. It may not be. I would say that that's more than okay. However, using black and brown figureheads as a way of... where was I going with this? Yeah, using black men and women figureheads as a way of, healing is... for black and brown men and women is, super important. However, I also think that, as a case manager, I'm not the case manager, you're the case manager. For yourself, I also think there's definitely a few practical ways you can get youth involved, well, sorry, not youth, just folk involved, but specifically youth involved in these kind of conversations when it comes to what they're going through. I haven't gone through some of the things that you've mentioned that they may have gone through. I don't feel like I'm the best person to comment on those things. I know when it comes as a blanket, the best way to get youth involved, I can comment on that, but when it comes specifically to those that are going through domestic violence, etc., I don't think I have the permission to speak on those matters.
So we're nearly out of time, and I wanted to ask Michael to answer this because he's done quite a lot of work with boys and men in relation to violence and things. Do you want to comment?
Yeah. So as I was saying, I think while I can't speak on those things, I also think that it's also important to what's it called? It's important to speak, what you're doing, that's your job. However, I think when it comes to youth, I think it's important to listen and find out what gauges them. How can you link them to these kind of conversations? What is healing for them? Especially for people of colour, I think, we don't really have strong media representations for us to link onto positive media representations for us to link onto as a way of healing. There's a lot of representation out there and visibility, maybe not as much, but there is a lot, but it does mean it's all good. So I think that as a way of healing and also being able to be practical with those kind of conversations, I think it's just important to, I guess, listen, see what works for them. Every case man is different, and it's a continuous conversation. I don't think there's any set thing. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to comment about, particularly in relation to young boys, that the questioner was talking about?
Look, I think they're difficult conversations, and just to speak to both that and the comment up the back from the person who teaches at university, I suppose I'm wary of kind of soft soaping what should be a robust critique of patriarchy, of patriarchal practices and beliefs and so on. So I don't think patriarchy oppresses men. I think it privileges men, but it also does limit men in some ways, and you can appeal to men's and boys' humanity as part of that, but you also have to acknowledge the genuine kinds of structural inequalities that I think privilege people, who occupy the category men. But on a more personal level, those conversations are hard, and I think there's ways to appeal to people's kind of values and principles around democracy and fairness and being nice and so on, and to appeal to their personal investments in the particular relationships they have with people around them, and to appeal to their kind of broader sense of a kind of reconstructed self-interest, a kind of anti-patriarchal self-interest in, it'd be nice for them personally if they had more equitable and trusting and respectful relations with others around them. But yeah, that's a much longer conversation, I think.
Thanks. We've got 1 minute. Is there anyone desperate to ask something, or should we wind up? There's a desperate... No? There's a desperate person over there. A very quick question, please.
It's not really a question, it's more in response to what we talked about. There's all things that you suggested which are really big things, and for the everyday person seems a little inaccessible or unattainable. There's so many small businesses and communities in Brisbane alone that are pursuing feminist traits and offering solutions and support, coaching, counselling, women's empowerment, retreats. There's so much available. We just need to kind of, tap into those smaller businesses and actually, by doing that, support women in business as well.
Thank you. Great comment, and I think a great note on which to end. Thank you. I'd just like to thank you all. You've been a great audience, lots of fantastic questions and comments. I really appreciate it, and it's been a long session. I think some of you have stood up or looked a bit uncomfortable for the last 2 hours, so thank you for doing that. That's terrific. So give yourselves a clap. And I'd like you to thank our panel members, Fleur, Kathy, Michael, Penny, Madeline and Sian. Thank you. So hang about if you want to talk to any of the panel members. I think they'd probably happily stay around for a little while. Have a drink, chat amongst yourselves. And I think I'd echo Sian's comment, go away and keep talking about this. Yeah. Thank you.